Good morning. My name is Jamie Bernstein, and as the Executive Director of the Children's Commission, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Judicial Trauma Institute. For those who are not familiar, the Supreme Court of Texas Children's Commission has a mission to strengthen the legal and judicial response in child welfare cases and ultimately improve safety, permanency, and well-being for children and families. Enhancing our state's ability to be trauma-informed and trauma responsive is absolutely core to that mission. The original format that we planned for March of 2020 was an in-person event with limited capacity of approximately 12 court teams. Although COVID-19 has prevented us from meeting in person, converting our first Judicial Trauma Institute to a virtual format has allowed us to invite additional court teams, child welfare stakeholders, and many judges from around the state. So whether you have been waiting to attend this conference since last year or have just recently registered, we are so glad you are here. The Children's Commission has been dedicated to the work of advancing trauma-informed care in the child welfare system for many years. The Judicial Trauma Institute is the work of many countless hours by our statewide collaborative on trauma-informed care training work group, as well as the Children's Commission staff. We are so grateful for the many stakeholders, speakers, and SCTIC members and co-chairs that have made this event possible. There are too many of you to name. Please know we are so grateful and we thank you very much for your efforts. The Children's Commission is proud to partner with the Texas Center for the Judiciary to bring this event to fruition. As far as we know, this conference is the first of its kind in terms of its composition, content, and audience. The Texas Center for the Judiciary and our speakers have prepared for this rollout 3 times, and we are very excited and proud to be able to share the first ever Judicial Trauma Institute with you today and tomorrow. A big thank you to the entire TCJ team, especially Courtney Gillison, Gail Bell, and Aaron Gutierrez, for all they have done to make the Judicial Trauma Institute possible. Next, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Judge Mark Atkinson. Judge Atkinson is the CEO of the Texas Center for the Judiciary and a stalwart supporter and partner of the Children's Commission judicial training efforts. Judge Atkinson, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining our Judicial Trauma Institute. Special thanks to the Children's Commission for allowing us to participate in this today. One moment, please. Some housekeeping notes I've got to give you first. While we remain committed to in-person educational conferences, the reality for the present is an online platform. Trust me, we are trying to get back to in-person conferences as soon as is safe and practicable. Technical assistance is available. Please email conferences@youronor.com if you need any assistance. We have dedicated IT professionals on hand to help us resolve all computer issues quickly. IT contact information can be found in the Q&A section of each session. You will not be able to unmute yourself or show video. You will not be able to see the names of other attendees or chat with anyone while in the Zoom webinar. If you would like to see a list of who's attending, please use the Attendee List tab in the top navigation bar of Brightspace. Each session has its own link, and you will have a 15-minute break between most of the sessions until the end of the day. You also will have an hour lunch break. You will need to navigate between Brightspace and Zoom between each session. When one session ends, go back to the Brightspace website, which should still be open in your browser. Select the appropriate time on the agenda page and use that Zoom link to join the next session. Evaluation forms are included under the tab for each session. We really value your evaluations. Please offer your thoughts to us. They will come automatically open in your web browser after each session. The MCLE forms for judges and attorneys can be found under the Continuing Education tab. A continuing education form for court coordinators can also be found under this tab. Continuing education course numbers for counselors, social workers can also be found under the Continuing Education tab. Additionally, certificates of attendance are available under the awards menu in the top navigation bar next to the attendee list. Users must complete the overall evaluation for the certificate to become available. We have a great turnout. We have 240 registered attendees. Although some may not be attending live right now, some may be watching the recordings or jumping on and jumping off. We have 16 teams comprised of judges, court coordinators, court managers, court administrators, prosecutors, parent and child attorneys, ad litems, DFPS caseworkers, supervisors, program administrators and directors, CASA directors and supervisors. 66 stakeholders that were invited by the Children's Commission based on work they've done in the area or service on certain work groups are also attending. We opened registration to our members, the Texas Center Judiciary members, which means our judges, and had about 60 judges register that include associate judges from child protective courts, associate judges of district courts, district court judges, county court at law judges, and judges who sit by assignment. We have attendees from every region of the state. Once again, thank you so much. It's a great honor for the Texas Center of the Judiciary to be able to participate in this project. We welcome you and thank you. Now back to Jamie Bernstein.
Thank you, Judge Atkinson, for those remarks. We appreciate you and your staff more than we can say. Next, I would like to thank Chief Justice Darlene Byrne. As many of you know, Justice Byrne is a judicial leader in many regards, and especially in the area of raising awareness of the trauma experienced by children and families who encounter the child welfare system. Chief Justice Darlene Byrne is the newly elected Chief Justice of the Third Court of Appeals. Prior to joining the Third Court of Appeals, she served for 20 years as the judge of the 126th District Court in Travis County. She has also graciously served as the chair of the Children's Commission's statewide collaborative on trauma-informed care since its inception in 2017. Chief Justice Byrne, we are grateful for your steadfast dedication in this area. It is my honor to invite you to speak a bit about the Commission's statewide collaborative on trauma-informed care and to give our audience an overview of what's going to happen over the next 2 days at the Judicial Trauma Institute.
And thank you, Jamie. Good morning, everybody. I want to, before we get started, the Children's Commission has done such a great job in preparing all of us for this conference today, and they provided me with some wonderful welcoming remarks. I wish I were good enough to be able to say those remarks without reviewing my notes. So I apologize if my eyes go back and forth to the notes. I apologize in the very onset related to that. But the notes are so great that I don't want you to miss anything. We're so thrilled to have you all here today. Since 2017, the statewide collaborative on trauma-informed care, also called the SCTIC, has brought together stakeholders from across the child welfare landscape to move our state towards one that is trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. The SCTIC focuses on moving all areas of the child welfare system to a trauma-informed system. In 2019, based on the work of the SCTIC, the Commission published a document called Building a Trauma-Informed Child Welfare System, a Blueprint. If you'd like a copy of that, it's available on the Children's Commission website. This document serves as a roadmap for all child welfare stakeholders to use as they collaborate in order to change organizational culture through a trauma and equity lens that keeps the needs and perspectives of children and families at the forefront of all policy and practice decisions. The courtroom is a key venue for effecting this change. As a district court judge, along with my staff and some amazing community leaders and stakeholders, we created a trauma-informed courtroom. Judicial leadership in this area is critical, but judges cannot create and sustain a trauma-informed court by themselves. From its inception, the goal of the Judicial Trauma Institute that you're participating in here today has been to bring together individual court teams to learn and strategize as a team. During the next 2 days, court team members should be thinking of how to bring back one or more ideas from this conference to your courtroom. Our very last session tomorrow includes a sample action plan to implement changes in your court. I encourage you to take notes throughout the conference as you come across ideas for implementing new practices and policies. If you're not attending with a court team, we hope that you find ideas and inspiration for advancing trauma-informed work in your area of influence. Although the next 2 days will focus on ideas for implementing trauma-informed practices into a CPS docket, we strongly believe that the concepts and practices discussed can be translated to any other docket, perhaps especially in family law, juvenile justice, and criminal court dockets. As we'll discuss over the next 2 days, trauma is often inherited and passed down in families. Environmental and historical trauma creates additional barriers for families to thrive. Without recognizing the trauma experienced by families, the court and child welfare systems can often impose further trauma. Utilizing a trauma-informed approach to support families as they heal and rebuild will pay dividends for years to come, and perhaps even into the next generation. Before I give you an overview of the conference, I want to acknowledge the very unique situation we have all found ourselves in this past year, and the collective trauma related to dealing with COVID, as well as Snowmageddon. We have all had to process this while also being challenged to recreate many of the same trauma-informed practices that we had in person to convening on Zoom, like today. This conference can be an opportunity to take stock of what works and what can change as we move back to our courthouses. And now to walk you through today's agenda, we're going to start with an amazing trauma expert, Dr. David Cross, talking with us about understanding relational trauma and its generational impact. And then we'll hear from my colleague and judge that took over my bench, my sister on the bench, Judge Aurora Martinez-Jones, Tanya Rollins, and Judge Cindy Wheelis. They'll be discussing equity as a foundation for a trauma-informed court. I think you're going to enjoy this presentation. I've seen these women present before, and it's really a remarkable and insightful presentation. Then we'll have an hour lunch from 11:30 to 12:30. And then after that, we'll hear from a multidisciplinary panel on starting the case with family strengths in mind. And then we'll end the day with a panel discussion on addressing behavioral health needs with a trauma-informed lens. I want to acknowledge that you're going to receive a lot of information in the next 2 days, but I also encourage you in this conference to take good care of yourself. If you need to step away, please know that these presentations of the interconference will be offered for a full year on the TCJ's platform. And finally, I want to thank you for sharing your time with us during the next 2 days. I personally want to thank the staff at the Children's Commission, especially Jocelyn Fowler for her great leadership in this work. And I also want to thank the staff members at the Texas Center for the Judiciary for hanging in there for 3 times a charm. And now we're going to kick off the Judicial Trauma Institute. Back to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Chief Justice Byrne. Appreciate your beautiful remarks and always reminding us to take care of ourselves and each other. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to the true brains and heart behind this operation, the mastermind behind the Judicial Trauma Institute, someone I'm very proud to have on our team at the Children's Commission. That's Staff Attorney Jocelyn Fowler, who will now kick off our next speaker.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Judge Atkinson, and thank you, Chief Justice Byrne, for those wonderful words. Welcome to our first session on the Judicial Trauma Institute, Understanding Relational Trauma and its Generational Impact. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Jocelyn Fowler, and I am a staff attorney with the Children's Commission. Our first speaker could not be with us in person for this third time's a charm JTI, but has graciously recorded his session so that we could still see his words. Dr. David Cross is the Reese Jones Director of the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development at TCU. You can review his full bio under the same tab that you found the Zoom link for this session, along with all the various handouts he mentions during his presentation. Dr. Cross has also agreed to provide answers to any questions you may have after the event. So please do use the Q&A feature down below on the bottom of your Zoom tabs and put in your questions, and we will make sure that we get them to him and get responses out about 2 weeks out. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Cross.
Okay, my name's David Cross. I'm the Reese Jones Director of the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development, which is part of the College of Science and Engineering at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. My name of my presentation is Breaking the Cycle by Solving for Pattern. And I've prepared this presentation based on our work at the Institute as we engage in various systems change efforts to improve the well-being of children from hard places. And this presentation in particular has been prepared for the Judicial Trauma Institute. I'm recording my presentation because our son's getting married that weekend, and we're gonna be traveling that day. So unfortunately, I can't be with you in live, but hopefully we can. This presentation, this recording will suffice. Okay, so. This presentation was inspired in part by this quote from Elizabeth Watkins. The quote is part of an interview she gave for All Rise for the Children, which I understand you've had the opportunity to view. Elizabeth is an outstanding. She has her sort of professional history is she was a social worker, a caseworker. And then she got her law degree, and she has served as an advocate and then in the currently in the DA's office in Waddington County. And what she said was, "We are breaking the cycle," and I never thought we could do that. And breaking the cycle is not easy, but All Rise for the Children gives us a glimpse about how it can be done. And I think Judge Matlock's paper, which is the basis of this presentation, also gives us a view of how it can be done. So the presentation has 3 parts. Part 1 is setting the stage. Part 2 is epigenetic landscapes. And Part 3 is solving for pattern. So, setting the stage. So this, I'm going to draw upon 2 articles. One's the focus article, and this is the essay by David Matlock and Michelle Perkins, which has itself 3 parts. Trauma and trauma-informed practices, a plan for action, and the project continues. And then I'm going to contextualize their work, kind of step back and give a wider or a more, general view of their work through the lens of Wendell Berry's essay, which is called Solving for Pattern. And his essay also has 3 parts. Part 1 is he describes 3 kinds of solutions, 2 of which are bad, 1 of which is good. Then he describes a case study in Solving for Pattern, which is Earl Spencer's farm. And then he outlines what he calls critical standards for solving for pattern, basically producing healthy solutions to social problems. And there are 14 of those in all. I'm going to focus on 3 of those and how they connect to David Matlock and Michelle Perkins article. Okay, so what in the handout, I have reproduced a few key paragraphs. I'm going to read those so I can comment on specific questions. So I call this Trauma 1. This is Judge Matlock speaking, where he says, in my 25 years as a juvenile judge, I have seen many children who were molested by an adult member of the child's household or family. Prior to the onset of the molestation, the child was friendly and doing okay in school, but afterward became withdrawn or began acting out. This was followed by poor grades and bad conduct reports, and then a cascade. And I want to emphasize the word cascade. That's going to come up throughout this presentation. A cascade of other behavioral and emotional issues, including negative peer associations, unhealthy relationships, sexual acting out, and drug-seeking behaviors. Each new unhealthy behavior brought its own new wave of trauma, followed by more and steadily worsening trauma-causing behaviors. Notice that he's describing a downward spiral here. So trauma 2, the child may have been removed from his or her home to prevent further maltreatment to the child or due to the child's own escalating behaviors. Notice that that's removal is a solution to a problem, the problem being this child is being mistreated. The removal was often followed by a series of disrupted foster home placements, progressively more unsettling placements in shelters, group homes, psychiatric facilities, hospitals, and eventually perhaps incarceration. At each new stage of placement, the child was exposed to increasingly restrictive conditions and more toxic interactions with increasingly troubled peers, leading predictably to new traumas experienced by an increasingly fragile and demoralized child. Notice again this downward spiral and this cascade of unhealthy outcomes caused by a very well-intentioned act in the beginning. So let's now switch to Wendell Berry's paper. Now, when Wendell Berry in his paper, if you look at all of his work over his lifetime, and he's won a number of awards, his interest is really healthy communities, and he has more of an agrarian perspective on that. But what he's really interested in is healthy communities. And in this article, he focuses on a farm as part of a larger community, but it's the healthy communities as his primary interest. So he says, there is first the solution that causes a ramifying series of new problems. Remember, think back to Judge Matlock's descriptions in Trauma 1 and Trauma 2. The only limiting criterion being apparently that the new problems should arise beyond the purview of the expertise that produced the solution. As in agricultural, industrial solutions to the problem of production have invariably caused problems of maintenance, conservation, economics, community health, etc. So for our child who's been removed from their home due to what's happening in the home, what starts out as a social work problem can become a psychiatric problem or a problem for or a criminal justice part problem. Solution 2. So anyway, let me go ahead and point out that this kind of solution that Berry describes in Solution 1 sometimes goes under the name of the law of unintended consequences. So when we remove a child, it's not our intention for the kinds of things that Judge Matlock describes to happen, but they very often happen despite our best intentions. So this is a good description of what sometimes is called the law of unintended consequences. So the second kind of solution is that which immediately worsens the problem is intended to solve, causing a hellish symbiosis in which problem and solution reciprocally enlarge one another in a sequence that so far as its own logic is concerned is limitless. As when the problem of soil compaction is quote unquote solved by a bigger tractor, which further compacts the soil, which makes it need for a still bigger tractor, and so on and on. It is characteristic of such solutions that no one prospers by them but the suppliers of fuel and equipment. And this solution two, another name for it, is a positive feedback loop, a feedback loop which keeps feeding back on itself in such a way that the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger and starts spilling over into other aspects of life and community. So these two kinds, Barry goes on, these two kinds of solutions are obviously bad. They always serve one good at the expense of another or of several others. And one example of that is as judges and you are hearing these cases in court, you're very often caught in the dilemma between the rights of the child and the rights of the parent. In a healthy family, the rights of the parent and the rights of the children are mutually reinforcing and mutual. They benefit one another. Whereas in these situations, then we very often find that we're kind of caught on the horns of a dilemma. So he says they always serve one good at the expense of one another or of several others, and I believe that if all their effects were ever to be accounted for, they would be seen to involve too frequently, if not invariably, a net loss to nature, agriculture, and the human commonwealth. So these are these two patterns, one the unintended consequences, the other one positive or reinforcing feedback loops, very often end up in bad ways. And then he goes on to say about bad solutions, such solutions always involve a definition of the problem that is either false or so narrow as to be virtually false. So here we can think of the solution being removal, and then in the context of criminal law. So what we very often see is the parents are criminalized, the children sometimes then, as a consequence, become criminalized because of their behaviors. To define an agricultural problem as if it were solely a problem of agriculture or solely a problem of production or technology or economics is simply to misunderstand the problem. Just like it's misunderstanding the problem. Just think of maltreatment or poor parenting in the home as simply solving that is well, we just remove them. The whole problem must be solved, not just some handily identifiable and simplifiable aspect of it. Okay, so that's what Barry has to say about bad solutions. Then I'm going to go on and they're going to switch back to Judge Matlock or Judge Matlock's voice. And he goes on to say, so what we just covered was sort of two different perspectives on bad solutions. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at good solutions. So this series of events can be stopped or even reversed if early in the process the child begins receiving effective trauma-focused mental health treatment and is able to live in a home and school environment with caregivers who are well informed about what behaviors to expect and how to respond to a child who has been severely traumatized. Okay, so I want to point out a couple things about this. One is that the whole notion of trauma-informed care and service. Okay, so that's one. And the other is that what he alludes to, Judge Matlock is alluding to here, is a system approach. So there's mental health treatment, there's the trauma-informed mental health treatment, there's trauma-informed caregivers, and there's also trauma-informed work being done in the schools. And so all aspects of a child's life, all those adults in their life are trauma informed. And what we need is a complete solution such as that. And I'll return to that later in this talk. So then, this is, where Matlock begins to describe, what the solution looks like, a good solution looks like. And then here's what Wendell Berry says about good solutions. He says, perhaps it is not until health is set down as the aim that we come inside of the third kind of solution, that which causes a ramifying series, I would put, of good solutions, of real solutions, of healthy solutions, as in the case, as when meat animals are fed on the farm where the farm is raised and where the feed is raised to be fed on to the animals that are on the farm. Even so, rudimentary a description implies a concern for pattern, for quality, which necessarily complicates the concern for production. The farmer has put plants and animals into a relationship of mutual dependence and must perforce be concerned for balance or symmetry, a reciprocating connection in the pattern of the farm that is biological, not industrial, and involves solutions to the problems of fertility, soil husbandry, economics, sanitation, the whole complex of problems whose proper solutions add up to health. The health of the soil, of plants and animals, of farm and farmer, of farm family and farm community, all involved in the same internested, interlocking pattern or pattern of patterns. It's systems change. So let me give you two examples from this to illustrate this before I move on to the next slide. So one example you saw in All Rise, and that is, you'll notice that the parents were engaged in I could go on. There's a lot of things I could say about it, but the key element was mental health intervention for the parents. The concern was for the children ultimately, but the focus of the intervention, the focus was on the parents of the kids and basically rehabilitating the parents. We saw that in All Rise. We'll also see that in Judge Clark's paper. I will give you one other example from one of the Institute's partners is MHMR of Tarrant County, their Early Childhood Services Program. They have developed a home coaching model in conjunction with DCFS, and they and what they do is they work they go to the homes of parents who are on the CPS radar but who still have their children, and they coach those parents using a trauma-informed program, TBRI in this case, and so that they can develop healthy patterns of parenting and keep their children, so the children, there will not be a need for removing those children. So that's prevention orientation, but the primary focus is on the parents and the pattern of relationship and interaction between parents and children. I will also add to that a big part of what that's about is addressing the trauma history of the parents, just like you saw in All Rise for Children. Okay, so here's one way that we can look at this. I think one way to look at this distinction between good solutions and bad solutions. So this comes from an article by Jim Henry and his colleagues at the Child Trauma Assessment Center at the University of Western Michigan. And then, based on their experiences and based on some research, interviews that were done with parents and teachers, their group identified two patterns, I call them mental models, of how adults interact with kids and how the adults perceive the challenging behaviors of kids. And they call them two different frameworks for intervention and how do we respond in the face of aggression. So the one framework is willfully this kind of where adults see the children's behavior, the children as being willfully disobedient. The other is they see the children's behavior as being survival behaviors. So this willful disobedience paradigm framework very often results in power struggles, which are exactly what Wendell Berry was talking about when he was talking about these positive feedback loops. And in contrast, and this is what we do in our training, is if we can see that the children's behavior is even, it may be wrong, it's challenging, but it's survival behavior given their developmental circumstances, and we can begin to address the need behind the behavior, then we can get a very different kind of cascade of positive effects. So we see the child is willfully disobedient. What happens all too often is we punish them. The punishment's not particularly effective. The behavior gets worse. We have more serious punishments. In schools, this very often ends up with children being sent to the principal, being suspended, ultimately being expelled or placed in special programs. In homes, what you see is timeouts and then potentially abusive behavior that where the child ends up being removed from the home. So, two different perspectives. One's trauma-informed, one's not trauma-informed, and one illustrates the sort of bad and good solutions that Wendell Berry talks about. So, for example, at the bottom on the left here, where it says the cycle of conflict is reinforced, that was Wendell Berry's pattern 1, that the idea of, that was actually, I think it's his pattern 2. Yeah, it's his pattern 2. God's sake, that's really bad on my part. It's his solution 2. And so where he talked about how there's this hellish kind of cycle of symbiotic cycle. And but what's also illustrated here is solution 1, where because children are caught up with adults, their caregivers, their teachers, whoever's in their life, in this cycle of conflict, they are not having the opportunity to learn socially. Excuse me, I screwed up my timer here. Pro-social behaviors, and instead they're learning the behaviors, and that will lead to them being alienated and rejected by their peers. And so then they introduce a whole new set of problems that revolve around peer relationships. Okay. The pattern that's described here on the right, it illustrates what the pattern that Berry talks about with his good solution, his solution 3, where there's what we in the field we call a negative feedback loop or a dampening feedback loop, and which basically promotes health and positive kinds of learning. Okay, so those are one way to look at the difference between these bad solutions and good solutions. Okay. And Berry goes on to say, a bad solution is bad, then because it acts destructively upon the larger patterns in which it is contained. It acts destructively on those patterns, most likely because it is formed in ignorance or in disregard of them. A bad solution solves for a single purpose or goal, such as the immediate removal of a child. And it is difficult of such, and is typical of such solutions that they achieve stupendous increases in production, if we're talking about agriculture, at exorbitant biological and social cost. So it's easy to remove a child, but then the long-term consequences can be devastating for the child and expensive for society. He goes on to say, a good solution is good because it is in harmony with those larger patterns. And I'm going to show you some examples here too. And this harmony will, I think, be found to have a nature of analogy. A bad solution acts within the larger pattern the way a disease or addiction acts within the body. A good solution acts within the larger pattern, but the way a healthy organ acts within the body. So a healthy family, so healthy relationships create, on the one hand, healthy families, healthy adults, healthy children, but then healthy communities are made up of healthy families, healthy parents, and healthy communities, and so on and so on. But it at once must be understood that a healthy organ does not, as the mechanistic or industrial mind would like to say, give health to the body. It is not exploited for the body's health, but it is part of the health. So healthy families depend upon healthy communities, and healthy communities depend on healthy families. The health of organism and is the same, just as the health of organism and ecosystem is the same. And these structures of organ, organism, and ecosystem, as John Todd has so ably understood, belong to a series of analogical integrities that begin with organelle and ends with the biosphere. In our field, the sort of parallel to this is our growing understanding of how trauma impacts the brain and epigenetic processes, and then in turn, how the changes to the brain and changes to epigenetic processes impact behavior and relationships and overall well-being. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about epigenetic landscapes. I'm going to say just a bit about this. This is a very complex. I thought about doing a presentation just on epigenetic landscapes, but I thought it was more important to have to present some solutions. But I do want to say a little bit about it. And the main reason I want to say a little bit about it is because I think it's important for us to understand all of the factors, even if we only superficially understand all of the factors that are involved with the kinds of things that as judges you see in your court. And as, you know, for us, as, you know, what we see when we're training individuals, whether it's parents or mental health professionals or teachers or folks in criminal justice or folks who work in the courts. So going back to Judge Matlock and his words, he says in his article with Michelle Perkins, he says, much of the awareness of the effects of childhood trauma arises out of the landmark Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente ACEs studies in 1998. From 1995 to 97, a group of scientists studied the effects of adverse childhood experiences, which go by the acronym ACEs, on the mental and physical health of over 17,000 adults. These studies showed that, quote, ACEs disrupt neurodevelopment and can have lasting effects on brain structure and function. These are the biological pathways that likely explain the strength of the findings from the ACE studies. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Here's if you go on the internet, there's all kinds of infographics about the ACEs studies. This is my favorite of all the ones I've seen. This one was produced by the 70/30 organization in the UK, and it kind of summarizes what ACEs are. So ACEs are traumatic events that can have negative lasting effects on health and well-being. They fall into 3 categories: abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual; neglect, emotional and physical. And by the way, neglect is, the research shows, is more damaging than serious neglect, is more damaging than abuse. As Karen Purvis would have said, the message of abuse is I don't like you. The message of neglect is you don't exist. And then a variety of household challenges, domestic violence. In terms of one of the things we know is that in terms of the impact on the brain and the epigenetic systems that go with it, or the processes that go with it, witnessing violence can be just as harmful as experiencing it directly yourself. Substance abuse by parents, mental illness by family members, parental separation and divorce, and an incarcerated parent. And basically the ACEs questionnaire is a simple checklist with these 10 factors, and how many of those did you experience of a child? It could go from 0 to 10. So here's some key findings. People with 6 or plus ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. About an eighth of the population have 4 or more ACEs. At Williamson County Juvenile Justice, they found that over 90% of their kids had over 4 ACEs. Basically, what the Williamson County leadership and staff say is that their program is a mental health program in the guise of juvenile corrections. Here are some things that are connected to ACEs. People who have 4 more ACEs have 3 times, they're 3 times as likely to have lung disease, 11 times more likely to abuse drugs, particularly intravenous drugs, 14 more times likely to commit suicide or attempt suicide, 4 times more likely to have early sex early in life, over 4 times as likely to develop depression, and over 2 times as likely to develop liver disease. So one of the things that's striking about ACEs is that the breadth of health and mental health outcomes that are impacted by adverse childhood experiences. And then here's a quote that I think summarizes what many leaders in health, in the world of health and mental health say, is that adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. ACEs are costing our country, if we were going to try to put it in dollars, it would be billions, if not trillions of dollars. And then the researchers in this field have identified what I call a developmental cascade, a toxic developmental cascade that starts with adverse childhood experiences. It goes to disrupted neurodevelopment, impairments in social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, adoption of risky behaviors such as drug or alcohol abuse, promiscuous sex, disease, disability, social problems, and then ultimately early death. So ACEs are serious and pervasive. And I think importantly, it's important to realize that the original ACEs study was a group of adults who, all of whom had jobs, all of whom were working, and the study was conducted through their healthcare provider. So this was a normative sample of U.S. citizens in Southern California. Okay, so then this is a diagram. This is a horrible diagram. One of these days I need to make a better version of this, but I want to show it to you because it shows you how complex the problem is. So this comes from a paper by Ramos, Fernandez et al., Laura Ramos Fernandez and her colleagues. and is published in a behavioral health or in a behavioral health and law journal. And the reason I wanted to show this to you, first of all, I want to point out that sort of say just a word about epigenetics. So why is it that the adverse childhood experiences are so impactful on such a wide range of health and mental health outcomes? Okay. Well, a big reason is that, and this is something we've come to understand only in the last 20 or 30 years, is that the body responds to experiences through epigenetic mechanisms. What are epigenetic mechanisms? So basically, as a human being, we inherit a genetic blueprint. That's our DNA, okay? But DNA is inert all by itself. It doesn't do anything. It has to be translated into proteins and all of the other building blocks of our bodies and our brains and our immune system through epigenetic processes. And epigenetic processes are responsive to environmental experiences. So if you have one person who grows up in a toxic home environment, they could have the same genetics as another person who grows up in a healthy home environment. But this person who grows up in that toxic home environment, through epigenetic mechanisms, will be much more susceptible, much more vulnerable to health problems, mental health problems, much more likely to develop all of those outcomes we associate with ACEs. Okay, but it's because of the way the body translates genetic information into the actual building blocks of who we are, including the brain. So it's if we have a person, a child or an adult who is vulnerable, who is behaving in ways that are not health promoting, that are challenging, that are destructive, part of that's learned. Part of that's based on observational learning, part of it's based on the parenting that they experienced, but part of it also is based upon their childhood trauma, both before they were born and after they were born. Okay, so the general point here is 2 points on this. One is that it's not simply, and I don't want to say that learning is simple, but it's not simply or merely, and I put those in quotations, a matter of learning and observation. It's also a matter of how these experiences, particularly childhood trauma, have altered our biology through epigenetic processes. Okay? All right. So we now in the field, we talk about factors that can promote health and resilience, and then factors which make us vulnerable or put us at risk. And I think one of when we say solving for pattern, what we're doing is figuring out how to switch from unhealthy, toxic patterns to healthy, relational patterns. Okay. One way to capture that is with what's called the epigenetic landscape. Imagine this ball as a child, okay? So if a child is being raised, and I'm going to simplify, but if a child is being raised in a healthy home environment, they may go down this pathway over here. And there'll be some differences. You know, one child may grow up to be a gymnast, another a football player. One might be securely attached, one might be insecurely attached, but basically it's different variations on healthy outcomes. Another child who's being raised in a family, in a home environment where there's toxicity, may end up going down another pathway. And if we don't intervene, like Judge Matlock described, or as Wendell Berry describes in Solving for Pattern, then this could lead to that ACEs cascade that I was talking about. But if we intervene, like you saw in All Rise for the Children, or like Judge Clark is seeing in his project in Cato County or Cato Parish, we can bump this child into another pathway, or we can bump this parent into another pathway. And notice that you got to go, there's a bit of an uphill here. And I think that is part of the thing. We have to, for this transition, we have to, the sort of bumper pads, if you will, for this person's journey have to be provided by the system while they switch from one trajectory to another trajectory, okay? And that's what solving for pattern is all about. All right, so solving for pattern. So in Judge Matlock, or in Michelle Perkins' article, they describe what, the project that they've engaged in there in Cato Parish. And I'm not going to repeat it here. This is sort of this is an outline of it. They created a strategic planning group, and notice that this wasn't Judge Matlock provided leadership, but he did not dictate the way this worked out. He created the context for the solutions to emerge. Okay, and this strategic planning group then created 4 working groups, one for screening, assessment, and referral, one for treatment capacity and the training team, one for caregiver training, and then one multidisciplinary trauma intervention team. And he talks about that in the article, and I'm not going to go into detail on that. So what I would like to do is take 3 of these standards that Wendell Berry talks about in the last part of his article and highlight those and discuss how those apply to what Judge Matlock and his team have done in Cato Parish in Louisiana. So Wendell Berry's second standard is that a good solution also accepts the limitations of discipline. Agricultural problems should receive solutions that are agricultural, not technological or economic. So that's his context. For us, our version of that is if you remember, just kind of go back to this. So there's a lot of complexity here. So the solution is not going to be a simple this or that. It's going to have a degree of complexity that matches this. And this solution that Judge Matlock sort of instigated and supported had a degree of complexity that matched the complexity of the problem. Another way of looking at it, which is something we often say in our work, is that at the Institute, is that relationship-based problems require relationship-based solutions. And I'll say a little bit more about that in the next, when I do the next standard. But we can't solve what is fundamentally a relationship-based problem through some kind of technological intervention. It has to be solved through relationships. There's no other way to do it, because it's only through relationships that the complexity of the problem can be matched. Okay? So there is a blueprint for this. So Judge Matlock's, his article with Michelle Berry lays out a blueprint that's specific to family court practice. A broader perspective on it which was provided by the Commission on Children at Risk in their monograph, Hardwired to Connect, the new scientific case for authoritative communities. And basically, what they describe is kind of what the problem we're talking about is a microcosm of this larger problem. And the larger problem is that we have too many children who are who are mentally ill, who are being failed by the system, and what they call for is a restructuring or a reconceptualization of how we care for children and how we intervene with children. And basically what they're talking about is systems of care. So I recommend you take a look at this if you get a chance. I want to say two things that are important about this. One is, and you can see them both in All Rise for the Children, and you also can see them in Judge Matlock's work. Okay, so two features I think are worth pointing out of what is talked about here is the authoritative communities. One is that I've already alluded to, which is the idea of a system of care. Remember that that one quote from Judge Matlock where he mentioned schools, he mentioned mental health professionals, he mentioned families, so that's part of what this authoritative community concept is all about. And then it also emphasizes the fact that that mental health professionals have a role, but their role is to work through parents, because ultimately parents, children are going to be in the care of parents and teachers most of the day. So mental health professionals are key. They have a key role, but they only account for, a child may see a mental health professional, once a week for an hour, say. Okay, so it's got to be a community of based intervention. All right, so that's that. Another standard is it's a standard 10. And according to Barry, good solutions exist only in proof and are not to be expected from some absentee owners or absentee experts. Problems must be solved in work and in place with particular knowledge, fidelity, and care by people who will suffer the consequences of their mistakes. There is no theoretical or ideal practice. So if you look at what Judge Matlock has done, what Judge Clark has done, and what other judges in Austin and in Travis County and in Williamson County as well have done, they're solving the problem in the context of their community. And one kind of conceptual way to think about this is through the Cynefin framework. And I have a little bit of a description of it in the handout, so I'm not going to go into detail. But what I want to say is, the main point I want to make is that as a community, when you're trying to solve these challenges, these patterns, and come up with ways of changing the trajectories of children's lives and their parents' lives, you're working in the domain of complexity. And complexity is the domain of relationships. And so you can see that in the example that's in the handout. You can also see that in the way Judge Clark organized and orchestrated the solution in Cato County, because he organized basically a set of working relationships that drew upon the expertise and the passions and the experience and the local experience of the people in his community, and organized them around so that they would solve for pattern as a community. Okay. And that's all about complexity. And what the Cynefin framework teaches us is that when we're in those complex problem environments, the solutions are not immediately obvious. They have to emerge through conversation, through work, through meeting, and they emerge as we make progress on our work. Okay, and then standard 13 in Barry's article is it is the nature of any organic pattern to be contained within a larger one. And so a good solution in one pattern preserves the integrity of the pattern that contains it. So I've already alluded to this in one way, which is a child is part of a home is part of a community is part of a larger pattern, and so on. And then a child is also not only a part of a home, but a school, maybe a church, maybe a soccer team, and so on. And so we have these various ecosystems, one word for it, these communities within communities. And we need to strive for health within all of that system. One way that we did that, the way we one of our projects that the Institute did in Travis County was the Travis County Collaborative for Children. And so our mantra for that was, we're going to, we want every adult who has a significant role in a foster child's life to be trauma informed in terms of their understanding and in terms of the way they practice and they interact with that child, whether it's a foster parent, a CASA, a judge, a mental health professional, a teacher, a counselor at the school, a coach on the soccer field, whoever it might be. And that's sort of one way of thinking about what's happened in what Judge Matlock describes in Cato Parish. But another way of thinking about it is that what Judge Matlock writes about is part of a larger project that preceded it and contextualizes Judge Matlock's article. And here's a roadmap for that larger project. This project was conducted as a partnership between Crossroads NOLA, which is an organization in the New Orleans area, and the Institute. And it started in 2014, and it continues to this day. And as you can, I'm not going to go through the details here, but you can see that there's been a lot of work done over particularly the years 2016, 17, 18, and then more recently 19. And then here are the components of the child's system that are involved: home development, judicial engagement, multidisciplinary training, and then stakeholder engagement. And so all of those different aspects have been touched upon more recently. And then so this project, this larger project, is how Judge Matlock learned about TBRI, which is one aspect of his solution, of his solving for pattern. Recently, I've talked to some of our folks who are involved in this project, more closely than I am. And one of the recent developments in terms of judicial engagement is there's now not only is Judge Matlock in Cato Parish involved with this overall project, but there are judges in Baton Rouge and judges in New Orleans who are also who are being trained, who are transforming the way they organize the activities of their courts, and basically doing it more or less in line with in the beginning stages of doing what Judge Matlock has done in Shreveport. And then I'll just close with one what one of those judges said, one of the judges in Baton Rouge said. He said that he was elected on kind of a get hard on crime or be tough on crime kind of platform. And so he developed a reputation for basically knocking heads and being tough on the kids who came into his court. And now it's 10, 15 years later, and he realizes that it not only did that pattern not work, but he realizes that it actually made things worse. And so he wants to apply a more trauma-informed approach. He's going to be working with the Institute and Crossroads NOLA and Judge Matlock to reorganize to the way his court works, and including family court, and then what I would say he's launching on a process of solving for pattern, where we look for solutions that promote health in the children, in the families, in the schools, and in the community. All right, so I'll close with this quote from Isaiah Berlin. To understand is to perceive patterns. Another great mind who emphasized pattern was Herb Simon, the only psychologist to win the Nobel Prize. And basically what he said was that expertise is simply a matter, not simply, but expertise boils down to a matter of pattern recognition. And then what I would add is, if you can see the pattern, you can't change the patterns until you can see the patterns. And that's what I hope this presentation has done for you, is helped you to see the pattern. And then through the articles that are provided are some of the tools that you can use. And through other presentations in this conference, in this Trauma Institute, hopefully you'll be able to receive some of the tools you need to solve for pattern. Thank you, and good day.